The courtroom fell dead silent as a Latina woman locked eyes with the judge and said, "I was ignored. Not anymore." Harvey Weinstein's smug defense crumbled with every word, until the judge leaned forward and asked the one question no one could answer. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The courtroom echoed with the sterile finality of justice declared. Cameras clicked once, then fell silent. Harvey Weinstein's eyes, hollow and reddened, stared past the judge's bench into a void only he could see. He looked like a man already buried, bloated, pallid, slumped in a wheelchair too narrow for the weight of his years and crimes. Beside him, his defense team sat motionless, their silence less about dignity and more about calculation. The judge's voice was firm but low, as if careful not to disturb the illusion that justice had been served cleanly, decisively. 23 years in state prison. From the gallery, quiet sobs broke the surface of that calm like small ripples, controlled, almost muted. A woman in the third row clutched a tissue in one hand and the strap of her purse in the other, fingers trembling. Another leaned against the shoulder of a friend, eyes vacant, as if only half present for the moment that was supposed to bring closure. Their pain was visible, but contained, because they'd learned to be, because they had to be, because the eyes of the world were still watching. Megan Hill didn't cry, she didn't clap, she didn't breathe for several seconds. She stood at the edge of the aisle in a tailored navy suit, spine straight, jaw clenched tight enough to ache. At 34, she was already known for being relentless in her prosecution of sexual predators, the kind of lawyer who memorized victim statements like scripture. But now she was frozen, staring not at Weinstein, but at the space around him. The empty chairs, the blank case files, the absences. Her voice barely cut through the murmurs as she leaned toward her partner. Something's off. She knew the list. The internal master file of potential victims had been over 100 names long, but only a fraction had been allowed to speak in court. Others had been labeled unreliable, irrelevant, or simply outside the scope. Some were quietly discouraged from testifying, emails flagged, phone numbers marked unreachable. Megan remembered a woman from Detroit whose file had been sealed without explanation after she claimed she was followed home from her deposition. These weren't just omissions. They were acts of disappearance. And now, the system applauded itself. The cameras would pack up, the reporters would run their headlines, and Weinstein, monster though he was, would become a closed case. Megan stood still, spine still straight, but every cell in her body screamed with the one truth no one wanted to hear. This wasn't justice. This was containment. And the worst part was, everyone seemed ready to move on. Everyone but her. The screen flickered with poor resolution, but the emotion cut through like broken glass. Megan Hill watched in stillness, the only sound in her office the quiet hum of the radiator and the trembling voice of a woman whose story had never made it past the lobby of the justice system. "She said I didn't seem credible," the young woman sobbed, her face partially hidden behind strands of jet black hair. "She told me, maybe I misremembered, that I wasn't the right type of victim." Megan's hand curled slowly into a fist against the desk. This wasn't an isolated story. This wasn't a memory failing or a claim forgotten in the chaos of a high-profile case. It was deliberate. It was strategic. The timing, the phrasing, the paper trail, or lack of it wasn't incompetence. It was curation, damage control, masked as prosecutorial discretion. A second file arrived moments later, then another. Dozens of names, emails, shaky phone footage, some from police station parking lots, some whispered confessions in dark bedrooms lit only by fear and laptop screens. Each woman had gone to authorities. Each was discouraged. And all of them, Megan now realized, had been rerouted, quietly, by the same man. Charles Denton, former chief sex crimes prosecutor, her old mentor, now a high-priced defense consultant who specialized in sensitive litigation. The irony clawed at her throat. Megan opened Denton's archived memos, pulled from the internal server before he'd left office. Language leapt out like poisoned daggers. Unsubstantiated, problematic witness, could derail optics. Entire lives reduced to risk assessments. He hadn't failed to investigate. He had ensured there wouldn't be an investigation. He had scrubbed the docket to make Weinstein's plea bargain shine just bright enough for the public, just quiet enough to close the chapter. It wasn't Weinstein she hated most in that moment. It was Denton. And the system that allowed a man like him to preside over truth with a red pen. This wasn't just a betrayal of justice. It was the burial of it. The rage Megan felt wasn't loud. It was surgical, focused, cold. The kind that didn't scream. It built. She clicked through each testimonial, face after face, story after story, her jaw tightening with every one. Not because they shocked her, but because they didn't. Because she'd suspected. Because the silence around the original case hadn't felt like closure. It had felt like cement poured over unmarked graves, and now they were rising. The courtroom was packed. Journalists shoulder to shoulder, lenses aimed, pens poised, whispering their doubts into phones before the hearing even began. They called it a formality, a postscript to a story already told. Harvey Weinstein sat hunched in his wheelchair, his pallor waxy under the fluorescent lighting, flanked by attorneys who wore their smirks like armor. They'd prepared for spectacle. They hadn't prepared for resurrection. Megan Hill stood at the prosecution table, flanked by a fresh team, young, meticulous, and pissed. Her file was thick with sealed testimonies, unearthed emails, unredacted reports. But she didn't begin with documents. She began with voices. The first woman stepped forward. She was African American, early 40s, in a dark blazer that couldn't hide the way her hands trembled. Her voice cracked but didn't break. I was interviewed, twice, then told my case was too distant to be relevant. The second, white, early 30s, had photos, emails, time-stamped medical records. She didn't cry. She seethed. They said my trauma would confuse the narrative, that it wasn't clean enough. The third woman was Latina, late 30s, with heavy eyes and a steady voice that sliced through the silence. I was ignored, she said, staring directly at the bench. Not anymore. There was no need to raise voices. Each testimony was a hammer, every pause a wound reopened. By the time the fourth witness stood, the room had shifted. The audience stopped taking notes. They were listening. Across the aisle, Weinstein shifted in his seat. His face, once unreadable, sagged with something new. Awareness. He looked up, really looked up, for the first time in the proceeding. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. A bead of sweat trailed down his cheek, caught in the crevice of his jawline. The defense attorneys whispered furiously, but their smiles had vanished. Their stillness now looked like strategy cracking into panic. And then the judge spoke, his voice low but firm. Why? He asked. Were these statements never included in the record? The room held its breath. The defense flipped pages, stalled, muttered about timelines, jurisdiction, admissibility. But the damage was done. This wasn't about legal procedure anymore. It was about the stench of something rotten surfacing at last. Megan didn't move. She didn't blink. She just watched as the narrative they'd built, polished, contained, controlled, began to unravel, thread by thread, under the weight of the truth it tried to bury. The courthouse steps were slick with rain, the sky a gray veil that softened the outlines of the city. Reporters jostled under umbrellas, their microphones pointed toward a marble facade that had, for too long, swallowed voices instead of echoing them. Megan Hill emerged not through the front doors flanked by cameras, but through the side exit, deliberate, steady, unflinching. She wasn't running from the spotlight. She was walking past it, towards something quieter, heavier, more lasting. The investigation into Charles Denton had broken open like a dam. Emails exposed, witness statements unearthed, judges and clerks subpoenaed. The phrase systemic suppression was no longer whispered in activist circles. It was front page, front and center, unavoidable. The same news outlets that had once celebrated Weinstein's conviction with polite satisfaction now ran new headlines, bolder ones. More victims speak out, prosecutor under fire. Justice delayed but not denied. Inside the courtroom that morning, the judge had ordered a secondary review of Weinstein's conviction, not to undo it, but to reckon with what had been left out. The voices that never had a day in court would now be formally recognized, transcribed into the record where silence once reigned. Megan hadn't smiled during the hearing. She'd sat still, composed, knowing that real victories weren't made of applause or camera flashes. They were made of paper, of testimonies signed and sworn, of legal orders with teeth, of names spoken aloud that had been erased from files just months earlier. Outside, as the rain fell light and cool on her coat sleeves, a woman in her 40s approached her with hesitant steps. Auburn hair pulled back, cheeks flushed not from cold, but from something deeper, recognition. Megan knew her from the files, from the hearing, from the silence she had broken. Without words, the woman wrapped her arms around Megan. No cameras captured it, no one interrupted. Just two women, one who had spoken, one who had listened. The woman leaned in and whispered, barely audible above the sound of distant traffic. "Thank you for coming back." Megan closed her eyes for a moment, not in relief, in release. It was never about reopening the case for the sake of history books. It was about restoring what the system had stolen: dignity, voice, truth. Justice didn't end with the verdict. It ended here, on wet pavement, in a quiet embrace, with the silenced finally heard.